I want to begin, as I mentioned, with the situation in Gaza. But before we speak about the so-called humanitarian encampments run by Israelis and American mercenaries, I want to get your thoughts first on the latest on the so-called peace agreement, ceasefire negotiation that is taking place between Hamas and well, it's not Israel so much, but with the Americans that they're discussing this ceasefire agreement. There are a number of things to observe. First of all, the talks have been led by, as I'm led to believe, by someone called Bishara Bahbah. He is a
Correct.
Palestinian American who led the group Arab Americans for Trump during the 2024 campaign. That's an interesting development. Maybe you can comment on that as well, and the general and how the ceasefire talks are progressing between Hamas and the Americans. Not Israel, it seems, but the Americans.
Well, Bishara Bahbah is a Palestinian American Republican and was actively involved in Palestinian or Arab Americans for Trump during the recent US presidential election campaign. He's a Harvard graduate. He obtained his doctorate from Harvard and, in fact, wrote his thesis on Israeli relations with Latin American terror regimes during the 1970s and 1980s. And it seems that at some point during the past few months, Hamas or figures in the Trump administration or both reached out to him to serve as an intermediary between Washington and Hamas after Israel leaked and sabotaged the direct discussions that the U.S. hostage envoy Adam Buller had been conducting with Hamas. Now, negotiations about a potential new agreement or a revival of the January agreement, which the incoming Trump administration imposed on Israel at the time. These negotiations have been ongoing. And what appears to have happened is that in recent weeks, Bahbah has been serving as a conduit once again for communications between the Hamas leadership and the Trump administration, specifically its effective Secretary of State, as I like to call him, Steve Witkoff, and the U.S. hostage envoy, Adam Buller. And it appears that they agreed on a set of basic principles for a new agreement. For the U.S., the priority is an agreement that leads to the release of all remaining captives in the Gaza Strip. For Hamas, the priority is an end to Israel's genocidal military campaign in the Gaza Strip, a withdrawal of all Israeli forces from the entirety of the Gaza Strip, and of course, an immediate and unrestricted surge of essential supplies to the population of the Gaza Strip. And they appear to have found a formula that includes some elements of what is called constructive ambiguity that appears to have satisfied both sides. Now, again, these were American-Palestinian negotiations. Witkoff then took the draft agreement to the Israelis. The Israelis, for whom the absolute priority is avoiding any agreement that brings its military campaign to a formal end, rejected it. And in a recollection, if you will, of the Biden administration's interaction with this file, and also for that matter, Witkoff in February of this year, the Americans then turned around and blamed Hamas for rejecting an agreement while also claiming that Israel had accepted it. There are some suggestions about a miscommunication that Bahbah miscommunicated core U.S. requirements to Hamas and that Hamas agreed to something different than what the Americans were proposing. But I would take that with a grain of salt. because Bahbah's role is very clear. He's only the messenger. He's not formulating proposals on behalf of either the Americans or the Palestinians. So the ball is now very much in the U.S. president's court, in Donald Trump's court. Will he allow this draft agreement to collapse with the obvious ramification of a further intensification of Israel's genocidal military campaign in the Gaza Strip, or will he use his authority as the leader of the U.S. to make that one phone call to Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and say there's a deal on the table. It meets our requirements. The Palestinians have agreed to it. It meets your requirements, and now you have no choice but to implement it. I think Israel's main problem is that while it is true that confronting genocide or preventing famine are not U.S. policies and certainly not U.S. priorities, and that Netanyahu and his government and his military have been given a very long leash to achieve their objectives. I think the problem for Israel is that it continues to fail. It is unable to achieve a decisive outcome in the Gaza Strip, and therefore time may be running out. It doubtlessly promised the Americans, if you just give us 1 more month, 2 more months, we'll achieve what we've failed to achieve during the past 18 months. And the Americans probably agreed to this and are now looking at the situation on the ground. There's still fighting going on immediately across from the Israeli-Gaza boundary, which Israel has now conquered God knows how many times. And then on the other side of the equation, which we'll be discussing later, this effort to provide an alternative to the United Nations and other aid agencies has been a total failure. In fact, today, Monday, is collapsing into total pandemonium.
Yeah, before we get to that, I want to just stay on the negotiations at the moment. You mentioned Trump. There seems to be an attempt by Hamas to bypass Qatar and Egypt. They want to have their own channel directly with the Americans. But the question still remains, how far can even Trump push this? He's trying all these different formulas, and in this case, he's brought in an Arab American-Palestinian. But as we've seen over the past 19 months, it doesn't matter what formula, what combination one uses. The bottom line is that Netanyahu isn't seeking to end the war. Netanyahu isn't seeking to even bring the hostages back. It seems like his main priority is the annihilation and the destruction of Gaza and the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in Gaza. So how much can even Trump do with all these new formulas and new negotiations that he's insisting on? But it seems like even Trump isn't willing to do what's required to force Netanyahu to do what's required to end this genocide.
I'm not sure I agree with your characterization that Hamas is seeking to bypass the Egyptian and Qatari mediators. Quite clearly, they now have a more direct, albeit apparently still indirect, line to the Americans. But I'm quite sure that they're keeping both the Qataris and the Egyptians fully informed and up to date on developments. And after all, it was the Qataris who enabled and hosted the direct talks held between the U.S. and Hamas in the Qatari capital, Doha, a few months ago. And I think what would be very useful now, although I can't imagine it happening, would be for Bishara Bahbah, or for that matter, the Egyptians and Qataris, to give a readout of what actually happened. During the Biden years, Biden and Blinken and Jake Sullivan and other senior U.S. officials were repeatedly coming to the podium and feeding us bald-faced lies that they knew were lies about what was actually happening and not happening in the negotiations, constantly claiming falsely that Israel had accepted what it had rejected and that Hamas had rejected what it had accepted. And This, of course, provided a more permissive environment, certainly as far as U.S. and Western policy was concerned, for the continuation of the genocidal military campaign. And in that context, I think it would be useful for those in the know to now just give a readout. You know, we have all these contradictory claims. Well, which are true and which are false? But again, I don't see that happening because for all of them, I think their priority is to maintain their relations with Washington rather than anything to do with the situation on the ground in the Gaza Strip. As far as Trump, yes, of course, the U.S. does, rather Israel and its lobby do have influence in Washington, most certainly in Congress, and they also, you know, have their loyalists and minions at senior levels of the U.S. administration. But at the end of the day, the United States is a superpower and Israel is a proxy. And if Trump genuinely wanted Israel to accept this draft agreement, it literally would take no more than a single phone call from Trump to Netanyahu informing him, this is what you're going to do, or else. And we saw that, for example, very clearly most recently in January, where it took just one meeting between Steve Witkoff and the Israeli Prime Minister to compel Israel to accept and to begin implementing what it had been rejecting for over a year. Unfortunately, of course, in February, the United States then tried to rewrite the agreement that was already being implemented and permitted Israel to basically abort it. But, you know, the lesson stands. Israel does as it's told when the United States decides that a certain course of action by Israel is required to meet basic U.S. interests.